I kept notebooks. And well, the way this book was written was that I was able to go back to them and be reminded of what some of those things had been and that I had written down, so that when I set out to write this book, I had this kind of outline, if you will. The reason I wrote the book is that I was about to do something. We were literally to start shooting the next day when New York shut down and COVID shut everything down for 2 years, essentially. And I was forced to sit and confront what all of it meant and to see it all. I was never one to look back at my movies. I had never been at all regretful. I'd never been celebratory of the past. The past was the past, and I was always forward-looking. What I was unbelievably moved by were the number of relationships that I was recalling about the process of making these movies. Hundreds of people, many of whom I had never nor would ever see again, with whom I had spent 3 a.m. in the pouring rain, fights in hotel rooms, love affairs and breakups and studio fights, and all these things that had gone on, and incredible fun, stupid silliness. And I realized that that's what my career had been. My career was the sum of those relationships and those moments. And I sat down to try to write this book in some way to honor or to comment or to examine what those moments had meant or what they were. Because the life that I had chosen was at the expense of friendships, parts of, things I'd given up about raising kids, my marriage, my health. And why had I done that? And was it worth it? And, and the answer is yes, but at what cost? We had some extraordinary faculty, and the reason I evoke Nina is her name was Nina Foch, who was an Academy Award nominated actress, an acting coach and a teacher, but she was a disciple of Uta Hagen and the Actors Studio.
One of the things that she tried to teach you was the camera is a Buddha. It sees the world as it is. It doesn't photograph your expectations or your fantasies. Try to see as the camera sees.
That's my interpretation of something that was very much about her. It was about being present. And what I'm trying to say is I was incapable of being present because my anxiety was such, and the sense of the critical voice on my shoulder, I was literally unable to breathe. You're then not capable of the kind of self-deception and disappointment that often happens when you try to put something together or see what's not there. And so this was really an important thing that didn't come about until a lot of things happened to me in my life. And those things, they had to do with both tragedy and with love. My mother was killed in a car accident, and I fell in love and ended up getting married. Without those two things, I'm not sure I ever would have confronted some of my own ability to touch some of those parts that had been blocked. Right? If you believe in things like, chakras and whatever, that it was here, but it somehow couldn't go down to here and this, and I didn't trust my own voice, and the voice that I would write in or the movies that I would make were not reflecting who I really was.
Marshall Herskovitz also went to AFI. They've been partners for many years, decades now.
I think we are the longest partnership in Hollywood today, and maybe ever. For those of you who do collaborate, in fact, you'd better collaborate, because that's the gift that you're being given here, whether you know it or not. Those people who are here are going to be that continuing education. And that's my point about Marshall, which is that we were there to do two things, one of which was to be each other's teacher, but the other was to be each other's scourge, because as things happen, as you do begin to gain some traction, there are fewer and fewer people willing to tell you when you're full of shit. And to be able to have someone who you can count on, in fact, who relishes the opportunity to tell you that you're full of shit, is quite it's a real advantage. So much of what you've done as a director is to try to create the simulacrum of life, when in fact it's a manipulation to accomplish that narrative, that moment, whether it's the growth of character, conflict, observation. You have to understand where that moment is. And that tells you where the camera wants to be at that moment and what it needs to see. Well, I can't tell you how many young directors I've worked with where I don't really know where they're looking in the frame because they haven't told me, they haven't made it clear what the intention was. And generally there's, when you finally break it down, there is only one place that you want the camera to be at a certain moment. It doesn't have to be a close-up. It could be just that person seen at great distance that creates an emotion, whatever, but it was intended to happen. There's a sense of intention and purpose to what is happening in the direction of the scene, rather than the photographing of life.
Right.
Because you're simulating life, you know, and yet you're trying to give it that feeling of it. Television's version of families and marriages were My Three Sons and Make Room for Daddy and horrible things that to me struck me as a kind of Ionesco bizarre horror shows. I mean, you know, people would just be incredibly sweet and straightforward and say what they meant and hug, and it was terrifying. And what we did really was to try to, again, be more honest about our experience of marriage or friendship, or it was a psychoanalytic paradigm too about how conflict happens and how it's resolved, but it just looked different and felt different.
It felt different.
The key that we said is it was about nothing.
Yeah.
We said that we wanted to reduce the emotional, reduce the physical stakes so as to heighten the neurotic ones. In other words, an episode could be about whether they could get a babysitter or not. They would only, as the onion was peeled away, reveal the fact that it's about a crack in their marriage that they weren't confronting, about how much they'd given up of their own pleasure and delight in each other because of the business of being married. And what's so interesting is that before that time, everybody on television was a fireman, a policeman, or a doctor, and it was only about the franchise. And all we did was make it about these people together. The funny thing now is that all television seems to be about is all these people together, that they're trying to find a reason to create different niches of togetherness.
Right.
But at the time, that was new. What you learn is that creativity, like love, is infinite. If you are a creative person, you are going to be able to create. And we who are artists carry our wares with us in our hearts and in our heads. We don't need anything but who we are. And that's a self-reliance that becomes very important when you get put in movie jail when a movie fails and you have to write yourself out of jail. We have these slots where we'd rather lose $100 million and make 300, because those are the multiples that have an effect on the shareholders report. And I did not realize as I was writing this book that in some sense this book is already, or becomes de facto, a kind of statement about what has happened.
Right.
Because you compare what exists now with what this book is about, and you can't help but see the differences. So your question, of course, is how do you, within this new reality,
Right.
still, find purpose and meaning? I think along with the privilege comes a responsibility. I actually feel that there's a certain amount of having a calling. That one of the things I'm doing is trying to put things out into the universe that might help or heal or at least articulate something that would otherwise be chaotic. I know why I'm getting up in the morning and doing it. And I'm not doing it about any of those reasons that I might have thought that I was doing it for. I'm doing it for love.